All right, so my name is Aaron Yarmel, and this is the first video in a two-part video series about a moral theory primer by Mark Timmons. So by the end of this series, you'll have a good grasp of some of the most important concepts that you need to be able to do well in a philosophy class about ethics. So let's jump right in. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about some foundational concepts. So we're going to be talking about why you should care about ethics. We're going to be talking about the distinction between the right and the good. So in part two, we're going to be talking about, section two of part one, we're talking about the right and wrong and the different categories of that. Then in section three of part one, which is what we're doing today, we'll talk about good and bad and the categories within that. So first thing we're talking about again is why care about ethics at all. All right, so if you're anything like me, you've realized that you were born at some point and you're going to die. And in the meantime, we have to figure out how we're going to get along, how we're going to live together in a society. And if you think about those things for even more than a couple of seconds, what you're going to see is that there are better and worse ways of doing that. A society that involves slavery is clearly a worse way of living together than one that doesn't. A society with rampant sexual harassment and rampant sexual discrimination is also one that is a worse way of living together than one that doesn't include those things. And so if you care about those things, or you care about whether you're being treated fairly, you care about whether people believe you when you tell them the truth, you're caring about ethics. You're really caring about these things. So I think that it's kind of a misleading question to ask why I care about ethics, because you already do. You can just kind of ask yourself, why do I care about being treated fairly? Why do I care about having people not inflict gratuitous suffering upon me for no good reason, right? As long as you can just ask yourself those questions, you'll have the answer to the question of why I care about ethics. But more importantly, there's this question that I want to pose now, which is, do you want to think about ethics well or badly? Do you want to do a better or a worse job at figuring out how we can live together in a way that works better? And if you're anything like me, which I imagine you are in this respect, you're going to want to do better at that. And that's what a philosophy class can help you with. So it's not going to, the philosophy professor doesn't come out and preach to you and say, here's all the right answers to the ethical questions. What they do instead is they say, here's some tools that you can learn. And if you learn them, you will be empowered to be able to do a better job of thinking about these questions and coming up with better answers to the questions of how we ought to live with one another. All right, so let's keep it going. So we're going to be talking first about right and wrong. So when we're talking about right and wrong, what we're talking about is the following: which actions should I perform? Which actions shouldn't I perform? Which actions can I perform? It's not wrong to perform them, but I don't have to do them. And we have some words that we use to refer to that. So we talk about obligatory actions, optional actions, and wrong actions. So let's go through some of those. When we're talking about obligatory actions, we're talking about actions like the following. You're walking around the street, you see a toddler drowning in a kiddie pool. So what do? What's the right thing to do? Well, you should go and save the toddler. Right? We're assuming nothing exotic, like the toddler is going to become Hitler someday, or the toddler is going to become a psychopathic serial killer. We're assuming that's the exception. That's not the rule. So if you see a toddler, the right thing to do, you should go and you should save the toddler. Pretty plausible, moral requirement. So that's what the obligatory actions are. The optional actions are something more like this. So right now, the lights behind me are blue. I could just as easily make them pink. So I'll do that right now. Did I have to do that? No. Was it wrong for me to do it? No, it was fine. I could have left them blue and that would have been okay. But it was fine to do it. It was an option to do that. It was morally optional, right? So if you look back at this slide, that's this sort of middle column, this idea of the morally optional actions. I can perform them, I don't have to, and it's not wrong for me to perform them. Then the morally wrong actions are those ones that it's wrong for us to perform. So for example, we talked about saving a toddler from drowning. Imagine we're contemplating pushing a toddler into traffic. That's wrong to do. I think there really shouldn't be any disagreement about that. It's wrong to push toddlers into traffic. Setting aside cases where the toddler grows up to be Hitler, we're going to Ignore those because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about you're walking around the street, you see a toddler, it is wrong to push that toddler into traffic, right? So hopefully that illustrates this distinction between the obligatory, the optional, and the wrong. Now, when we're talking about the right, we're talking about the obligatory and the optional. We're talking about these two categories, and then the wrong is over here. All right, so there's also good and bad. So often people will come and ask, like, am I a good person? Is the world a good place? Is human nature good or bad? And when they're asking that, they're not asking about the permissibility of a particular action. What they're doing is they're talking about the goodness of a state of affairs, a goodness of a situation, of a scenario, of an arrangement of things. And when we're talking about, goodness and badness, we're asking questions about value. And there's two types of value that philosophers talk about. There's intrinsic value and there's extrinsic value. So when we're talking, let's start with extrinsic value. So this here is a $20 bill. Is this valuable? Well, the first thing to say is that it's not valuable in and of itself. The fact that this is here in the room doesn't automatically make the world a better place. Like, if there was no society and there was no way that I could exchange this for anything else, it would just be a piece of paper. It doesn't have value in and of itself. If it has any value at all, its value comes from the relationships into which it can enter, or more specifically, the relationships into which I can enter with it. So that's extrinsic value. Now, we're talking about the extrinsic value of this $20 bill. We can also talk about the extrinsic goodness or badness of it. So, is it extrinsically good? Well, I can go buy a sandwich with it if I'm hungry. I can go buy water with it or a cup of coffee with it if I am thirsty or tired, right? So that's how we make the case for it being extrinsically good. But we can also make the case for it's being extrinsically bad. So if I use this to pay somebody to go punch somebody else, that's an example of it's being extrinsically bad, right? And then if I'm using it to fold it rather than to keep it flat, that's not really good or bad. It's just kind of neutral, right? And so when we're talking about the extrinsic goodness, badness, or neutrality of something, we're basically what we're doing is we're talking about the relationships into which it figures, right? And whether once we look at those things, the world becomes better or worse. But when we're saying it, when we're talking about its extrinsic value, we're not talking about it being good in and of itself. And so that's extrinsic value. Now, what does it mean to say something is good in and of itself? So there we're talking about intrinsic value. So when we're talking about, and something can be intrinsically good, it can be intrinsically neutral, or it can be intrinsically bad. Now, let's contrast two things. Let's contrast pleasure and pain. So on some theories of morality, pleasure is good, pain is bad. When there's more pleasure in the world is a better place. The state of affairs that exists now is better than the state of affairs in which there was less pleasure overall. And all other things are kept equal. If we have a state of affairs where there's more pain in the world, now the state of affairs is worse. And that's because, according to those theories, pain is bad simply because it's pain. Pleasure is good simply because it's pleasure. It's not that pleasure is good because when you feel pleasure, you can go out and work more and then gain more money or something. Those could be nice extrinsic values of pleasure, right? But when we're talking about the intrinsic value of pleasure, what we're talking about is just when there is more pleasure in the world, is the world, based on that alone, a better place? Okay. When there's more suffering in the world, take a look at the intrinsically bad spot. The world is just a worse place simply because there's more suffering in the world. All right. So that is a basic look at some of the most foundational, important concepts that you're going to need to know to understand what's going on in your philosophy class. And stay tuned for part 2, where we look at some specific moral theories. Thanks very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.